Shalom, I'm Tamar, and today I want to talk about compassion for suicide, particularly those who die by suicide and survivors of suicide. The people they leave behind, their loved ones. And I want to talk about this because I personally believe there needs to be more of a public conversation about suicide, and particularly by people of faith who have information about suicide from a spiritual perspective. The academic community has a lot of information about mental illness and suicide, and often they discuss suicide from the perspective of mental illness. But I believe that's only one puzzle piece of the entire picture. And that the academic community, although they've done a wonderful job of scientifically documenting this information, they're describing more of a symptom rather than a cause. And in order to understand suicide from a holistic perspective, I believe there also needs to be information and understanding about the issue from a spiritual perspective. This doesn't mean I'm going to divorce fact from faith. They actually can work together to help us understand the issue. And I want to share my understanding and the knowledge that I've gained from the Hebrew Bible because I'm uniquely positioned as a survivor of suicide and also as a scholar of the Hebrew Bible. As a survivor, I lost both my father and my late husband to suicide, and I've also been a scholar of the Hebrew Bible for almost 2 decades. So I want to share with you today my testimony as a survivor, and then I want to build on that testimony, placing it within the Hebrew Bible. There's a lot of universal truth. My testimony is not necessarily unique to me. There's elements of my testimony that many survivors of suicide share. So I believe that the information in the Hebrew Bible is relevant for so many people. And I believe it needs to be shared because there are many people who are given moral judgments as survivors, and their loved ones who died by suicide are given moral judgments which don't necessarily align with what the Creator has to say to us in the Hebrew Bible. So first, allow me to please share my personal testimony of how I am a survivor. And I'm going to only share the most important elements of my story. It's not going to be overly graphic because I don't believe that those details are necessary for what I want to say today and what I want to share. And as a proper online internet etiquette, I will give a trigger warning that I will mention the method of suicide for both my father and my late husband, but I will only share general details as they relate to what I want to say later. So when I was 20 years old, I received a phone call at work telling me that my father had shot himself. My father did use a firearm, which is, sorry, let me take a sip of water. Firearms are the most common method of suicide for males. And when I received the phone call, I was under state law what is considered next of kin. So it was my responsibility to bury my father and make arrangements. I wrote my father's eulogy and I buried him. And my sister and I went back to his home to attempt to clean up as next of kin his belongings. He was a renter at the time. His landlord had done some cleaning of his bedroom, which is where he chose to die by suicide. And there were other things that were not cleaned up that I was exposed to. I did not witness my father's suicide, but he also was one of the 10 to 15% that do leave a note. And my takeaway from that note, it was about 3 paragraphs long. My takeaway was that he was in a state of despair. I saw no indication of mental illness in my father before he died. We had a strong bond, and I saw no indication that my father had demon possession either. That wasn't a factor. With my late husband, there were some elements that were similar to my father's death, but there were also some elements that were different. My late husband chose a similar method of suicide, a firearm, which again is very common for males. Females tend to choose other methods like poisoning. With my late husband, I also witnessed his attempts for suicide, and this led me to witness his actual completed suicide. My late husband made 3 attempts with a firearm in front of me, in which we became entangled in words. My first reaction was to cry, and then I became angry. And I also got to a point where I decided to hide behind a door. It was also the first time I had stood that close to somebody using a firearm in that way. So I was terrified, to be honest. But even during this time, I saw no indication of mental illness in my late husband, and I saw no indication of demon possession. We had a series of conversations like we always did the week before he died, and during that time, he was placing within the conversations subtle hints and clues that I didn't quite piece together. It was after the fact. It dawned on me the reasons for it. But like my father, he did show signs of despair, and the things that he said indicated to me that he felt he was facing some inescapable circumstances created by a third party. So in the beginning, when I was widowed by suicide, I saw a range of reactions. I attempted to keep it a private issue for a while, and I felt like the people that I reached out to confide in, whether they had an inability to understand or they just couldn't have empathy, there were some reactions that I was honestly surprised by, especially by those who I would consider to be in my more immediate religious community, because in my lifetime, one thing I've witnessed is people have a tendency not to show you compassion and empathy if you belong to another religion or have different religious views. But even with those whose religious views were very much in line with mine, I saw some very startling reactions. And this was the first time I encountered this, because with my father's suicide, I hid it a lot. I didn't tell a lot of people. I was very young then. I was only 20 years old. I didn't know how to grieve then, and I didn't know what resources were available to me. But when I was widowed by suicide and I wasn't receiving care and compassion from a couple dozen people that I had reached out to, I decided to share my testimony publicly. And that is when I received more of an outpouring of empathy from a larger scope of people around the world, which I was so grateful for, because my outcome could have been different if that empathy and compassion wasn't there. But there were still isolated incidents of condemnation, victim blaming. I also saw religious fanaticism, like blaming suicide on demon possession. And there's no indication in the Hebrew Bible that suicide is widespread because of demon possession. There is a scholar, Yael Shemesh, who has done a fine job of documenting suicide in the Hebrew Bible. I recommend that person's article. for understanding suicide within a spiritual context. And Yael Shemesh mentions in that article that there are 6 documented cases of suicide in the Hebrew Bible. 6. And they aren't centered around demon possession. I want to focus on the suicide of King Saul and the suicide of Samson. And one thing that stood out to me in these stories is that the people of Israel still mourned King Saul and Samson after they died by suicide. There was no condemnation in their death. It was a situation of sorrow, because as we know, the Most High does not delight over the death of their people. And I'm going to turn to 2 Samuel 21. I want to read that first. All right, so 2 Samuel 21, and it starts in verse 14. In the middle of 14. So it's describing how King David got the bones of King Saul, because first the enemy beheaded him, then some of the men of Israel had begun to burn him, but King David went and took his bones, because in the Hebraic way, the people are buried. They're not cremated. And it says that only after that, so after David got his bones and buried them in the tomb of Kish, it says only after that was Elohim prevailed on to show mercy to the land. So when King David showed care to bury King Saul, even though he had such a tragic end, it pleased Elohim. It brought the mercy of Elohim onto the land. Also in 2 Samuel 31, I had a marker here, but it seems to have disappeared. No, it's actually 1 Samuel 31. That's why. Okay. So King David took the bones, and it wasn't only the bones of King Saul, but also of his sons. And it says, then they took their bones, buried them under the tamarisk tree in Yavesh, and fasted 7 days. So this is a type of mourning in the Hebrew Bible. Even though he died by suicide, the people of Israel mourned King Saul. And there was no set time of mourning in the Hebraic way. Listen, the Hebrew Bible, it varies across the board, but they still mourned King Saul. They didn't condemn him. They didn't speak evil of him. And that brought the mercy of Elohim. Also, when Samson dies, in the book of Judges, I have notes here, 31. So what's interesting is before Samson dies by suicide, he cries out to Elohim. Shimshon called to Adonai, Adonai Elohim, revenge on the Philistines for at least one of my 2 eyes. And I skipped a line. Let me read that again. Adonai Elohim, just this once, please think of me, and please give me strength, so that I can revenge on the Philistines for at least one of my 2 eyes. I think this verse is important to mention because there's often a moral judgment that people who die by suicide are wayward and out of touch with the Creator. And that's not always the case. I'm sure there are incidents where people are summoning the devil and there is demon possession involved. That's not the majority of cases. And there are many people who love their Creator and who walk with faith, and yet they collapse under their circumstances, which I want to expand on later. But this is illustrated in Samson's story. He had a relationship with the Creator. In fact, he asks his Creator to give him help to die because he's crushed under the weight of his circumstances. And this is how the community of Israel responds. His brothers and all his father's family came down, took him, brought him up, and buried him between Sorah and Eshtaol in the tomb of his father Manoach, and he judged Israel for 20 years. So they took time to bury Samson. They didn't condemn him. So even from those two examples, because we only have a limited number of examples of suicide in the Hebrew Bible, but these are the two that stand out the most. And in those examples, there's no demon possession involved. In fact, there's not one incidence of demon possession in the Hebrew Bible driving somebody to suicide. There's a limited story or a limited case of demons, and in fact, it's called the adversary or the enemy too, entering somebody's body and inciting them to do something evil. It says in 1 Chronicles 21 that the adversary entered King David's body and incited him to take a census. There is a textual variant in another place in the Hebrew Bible that says it was actually Elohim that did this. But I'm going to side with the scholars who agree in 1 Chronicles 21 that it was actually the adversary. There's also, interestingly, a case in the Dead Sea Scrolls of Abraham doing an exorcism on a pharaoh to alleviate him of demon possession. But other than these two limited number of cases, there's not a widespread number of stories in the Hebrew Bible that say suicide is caused by demon possession. So what is it? And a lot of times I've seen I'm going to grab it here. Psalm 34:19 used as a moral judgment to say, well, the Creator will save you from anything. And it's often quoted, many are the afflictions of the righteous, but Elohim saves them out of them all. And there's a few problems with this translation. The first problem is that the Hebrew word for affliction is anah. And that word is not used in Psalm 34:19 in the Hebrew. It actually is the word rot, which means the plural of evil. So many are the evils of the righteous, but Elohim saves them out of them all. So what does that mean? Because we can't understand that in isolation. Does it mean that every time something evil happens to a good person, Elohim's just going to save them? There's no textual evidence to support that. Because there are many righteous people, and I made a list of them, many righteous people in the Hebrew Bible that were not saved from difficult circumstances. And one of the first ones we all learned as children is the story of Abel. Abel was not saved from murder. Lot, he had to flee. He wasn't saved from the destruction of his house. Isaac was not saved from persecution. He had to run from town to town when people were taking his wells. Leah, she wasn't saved from being used like a pawn. Dinah, she wasn't saved from being defiled. Joseph wasn't saved from prison. King David was not saved from being stalked. Elijah wasn't saved from persecution. Tamar was not saved from sexual assault. Jeremiah was not saved from persecution. Daniel was not saved from captivity. And John the Immerser was not saved from being beheaded. So we can't interpret Psalm 34:19 to say that everything that happens difficult or evil to a righteous person is going to be redeemed and there's going to be no suicide. That's just not what the Hebrew Bible teaches. The Hebrew Bible actually outlines compassion for the oppressed, which leads them to Sheol, which is a place of despair, and even suicide. And I want to expand on this because there are situations in the Hebrew Bible, notifications distracting. There are situations in the Hebrew Bible where killing is justified because you get a lot of pushback saying, thou shalt not kill, end of story. But again, that's taking a verse in isolation without any attempt to understand the whole picture holistically. And for example, the Creator did tell the Israelites to kill the people of nations who had become perverted. And some people say, well, how can a loving Creator command killing? But we have our own versions of this, even in the secular world and in humanity, when a person is so perverse that they are hurting other people. In the Hebraic way, they have to be cleansed out. Our closest word in English is serial killer. Would somebody say that a serial killer should not be put to death? I don't see the logic in that, but I don't want to talk about that. I don't want to get too far into that. I want to show more examples when the taking of human life is justified in the Hebrew Bible. Another one is capital punishment in the Torah. There are situations in which the Creator decided that the most righteous thing to do is to put a person to death in particular situations. There's a whole list of them in the book of the Torah. Also a kinsman avenger. This is one of the most popular in movies. Somebody kills somebody's relative and somebody else avenges the blood of their relative. That concept is from the Torah, in which case the taking of that human life as an avenger, when you're avenging the blood of your family member, is justified. The focus in Torah is on spilling innocent blood. That is the taking of human life. That is not justified in the Torah. So in some situations, we cannot condemn people who die by suicide. There's no punishment for suicide in the Torah. And that is why the Hebrew Bible leans towards compassion on this issue. I also want to point out that somebody might mention that it's an intentional sin because you're intentionally premeditated taking of your life. But in Numbers 15:30, when it talks about intentional sin, there is a word there, and it's Ramah Bayad. It means a sin done with a high hand. It's a sin done with pride. You know you shouldn't be doing something, but you're just like, whatever. Who cares about the Creator's law? I'm going to do this anyway. But suicide is not that kind of action. It is an action done from utter despair, hopelessness. And in that way, we can't say that it is condemned as an intentional sin. So let's dive more into this from a spiritual perspective, because this is beyond mental illness. Mental illness is the symptom, but the Hebrew Bible gets into the cause. And I'm going to break this down into two main causes that I see in the Hebrew Bible. The first is the prophecy in Deuteronomy 28:65. I'm going to read that one because it's very important to know this prophecy line by line. Okay, so in this prophecy, Elohim is telling the children of Israel that when they break the Torah, they will be dispersed among the nations. And it says, among these nations you will not find repose, and there will be no rest for the sole of your foot. Rather, Adonai will give you their anguish of heart, dimness of eyes, and apathy of spirit. Okay, this is prophesied for all the children of Israel when they are scattered among the nations, and for their descendants. This is an ancestral curse, and it can't be broken unless you're in the land of Israel, because the Torah does say this law is made for you to reap the highest blessings, and I'm paraphrasing, but there's communal blessings in the Torah, and those are within Israel. When you're scattered among the nations, you can't reap those communal blessings. You can reap the individual blessings, but when you're so far apart from each other as Israelites, you're not going to thrive in the way that you would in a community living with Israel. A lot of people dismiss Deuteronomy 28:65 as it doesn't apply to them. But it goes further in the Torah. It says that this is on the descendants of Sarah and Abraham forever. And that means that even if you have one drop of blood in you, as a descendant of the people who stood at Mount Sinai, you're going to feel this ancestral curse. There's no way around it until the children of Israel are regathered completely, all of them, into Israel. And I'm going to share some more information from the prophets which confirm that. So, if you are a descendant of Sarah and Abraham, you will have more struggle in this life living among the nations. If you've ever wondered why you might have felt different in society, it's likely because of this. Because it's the descendants of Sarah and Abraham that are given a certain command and are given a certain prophecy. And I want to show from Psalm 137 that even after Deuteronomy 28:65 was written, the children of Israel still grieved the loss of Israel. Psalm 137 reads, "By the rivers of Babel we sat down and wept, as we remembered Zion. We had hung up our lyres on the willows that were there, when those who had taken us captive asked us to sing them a song. Our tormentors demanded joy from us. Sing us one of the songs from Zion. How can we sing a song about Adonai here on foreign soil? If I forget you, Yerushalayim, may my right hand wither away. May my tongue stick to the roof of my mouth if I fail to remember you. If I fail to count Yerushalayim, the greatest of all my joys." So here in the first 6 verses of Psalm 137, we see evidence that the children of Israel are mourning while they're outside of Israel. And this is bound up in the blood of the descendants of Sarah and Abraham. We're bound to it. We are not going to thrive when we are living among the nations. Psalm 137 mentioned it. We are going to be captives. It goes even deeper. We are going to be oppressed. And I want to talk about this oppression of Elohim's people among the nations, because it's often referred to as anti-Semitism, but there's more. Anti-Semitism is generally spoken of as directed to the house of Judah, which are called in modern day terms Ashkenazi and Sephardic, and that they are the house of Judah. There are also other tribes whose DNA we don't know, and they are being oppressed too. And in fact, we don't even know all the DNA of Ashkenazi. There's many studies about that. They haven't even finished tracing it. So it's told in the Psalms and the prophets and in the Torah that we are going to be oppressed as the people of Elohim when we are scattered among the nations. This is not taught commonly, the importance of being in Israel as a community, but it's there. And it requires us to understand the difference between 4 terms in English, but I'm going to dive into the Hebrew. Affliction, oppression, punishment, and curse. Because we can't say that everything bad that happens to the people of Israel is a curse. We can't say, oh, look, something bad is happening to you. You're being punished. It takes more effort to understand why a person is struggling. And it shows in the Hebrew Bible that the people of Israel will be afflicted when they are scattered among the nations. It shows that they will be oppressed. In Genesis 15:13, there is a prophecy given to Abraham that his descendants will be afflicted in Egypt. And that word used there is anah. That word anah is used again in Exodus 1:11 and 12 to say that the children of Israel were afflicted by the Egyptians. The prophecy given to Abraham came true. Leviticus 16:29, it says we are to afflict ourselves on Yom Kippur, uses the word anah. In Deuteronomy, it says that Elohim afflicted the children of Israel by feeding them manna so they would learn a lesson. And in Jeremiah 22:3, it uses the word oppression, but it's related to the word anah. It's yana. And in Jeremiah 22:3, Elohim commands his people to release those who are oppressed. There's a third word I also want to emphasize, And it's Strong 7533. Ratzatz. And that means to crush or oppress somebody. And I want to bring this up because it's the famous Isaiah 58:6 passage where we are commanded to let the oppressed go free. And that word there is used, ratzatz. It means to utterly crush a person. So in Jeremiah 22:3 and Isaiah 58:6, we see Elohim having compassion and pity for his people who are being crushed and oppressed, and those who have it in their power to free them and to help them are told to help free them. There's no condemnation. And this is important to know because that lack of condemnation means that when somebody is utterly crushed in their circumstances of oppression to the point of suicide, we should care and we should mourn when the children of Israel fall. We should not be pointing the finger and saying you're demon possessed, because when we start pointing the finger and saying you're demon possessed, we start creating a culture in which people don't want to reach out for help. The silence of suicide is furthered. People hide it because they're concerned about people's reactions to their circumstances, when really their circumstances are often created by a third party oppressing them, and they don't see any way out of those circumstances. I want to talk further about oppression. In Psalm 10, it talks about the wicked person who crushes. It doesn't use ratzatz there, it uses another word, but it speaks about how the wicked person creates schemes in which the other person is caught up in them and oppressed. In Isaiah 49:25-26, Elohim begins to speak about salvation from oppressors. But I particularly want to turn to Habakkuk because the first chapter speaks volumes about the concept of oppression and about how Elohim will answer his people to free them from their oppressors. Let's get into that. Let's go to Habakkuk. This is the prophecy which Habakkuk the prophet saw. Adonai, how long must I cry without you hearing? Violence, I cry to you, but you don't save. Why do you make me see wrongdoing? Why do you permit oppression? Pillage and cruelty confront me, so that strife and discord prevail. Therefore, Torah is not followed. Righteous ruling never gets rendered, because the wicked fence in the righteous. This is why righteous ruling comes out perverted. Look around among the nations. What you see will completely astound you. For what is going to be done in your days, you will not believe, even when you are told. I am raising up the Kasdim, that bitter and impetuous nation, who march far and wide over the earth to seize homes that are not their own. Fearsome and dreadful they are. Their rules and strength come from themselves. Their horses are swifter than leopards, fiercer than wolves at night. Their cavalry gallop in from afar, flying like vultures rushing to feed. All of them come for violence. Their faces set eagerly forward, scooping up captives like sand. They scoff at kings and princes they deride. They laugh at any fortress. They pile up earth and take it. Then they sweep on like the wind, because they become guilty, because their strength is their Elohim. Okay. Then Adonai answers in in chapter 2 to save them. Let's reiterate verse 13 here too. When Habakkuk goes on, Adonai, haven't you existed forever? My Elohim, my Holy One, we will not die. Adonai, you appointed them to execute judgment. Rock, you commissioned them to correct us. Your eyes are too pure to see evil. You cannot countenance oppression. So why do you countenance traitors? Why are you silent when evil people swallow up those more righteous than they. Pause. So here we see evidence as Habakkuk is mourning the captivity of his people and oppression, that Adonai is letting this happen. Yes, it says in verse 12 that oppression is also a form of correction. And that goes back to Deuteronomy 28:65, when it's prophesied that we will suffer for the sins of our ancestors. And there's no way around it until we are saved from those oppressors. That goes onward into Zephaniah 3. And let's focus on 18 through 20. Elohim promises, I will gather those of yours who grieve over the appointed feasts and bear the burden of reproach. When that time comes, I will deal with all those who oppress you. I will save her who is lame and gather her who was driven away and make them whose shame spread over the earth the object of praise and renown. When that time comes, I will bring you in. When that time comes, I will gather you and make you the object of fame and praise among all the peoples of the earth when I restore your fortunes before your very eyes, says Adonai. So that passage shows that the time of relief from oppression has not yet occurred for the people of Elohim. This kind of oppression creates inescapable circumstances for people that drive them to the point of suicidal ideation. Examples of inescapable circumstances are incarceration, which is not a biblical punishment, poverty, abuse, sexual assault, sexual trafficking, kidnapping, and scapegoating, for example. A lot of family scapegoats and people bullied and scapegoated in society begin to develop suicidal ideation. I want to give you an example of this too. There was a girl named Rachel who was a 12-year-old girl that lived in a Mormon polygynous cult. And they were going to force her into an arranged marriage without asking her how she felt. She went to the authorities in the secular world for help, and they sent her back home. When she realized she could not escape this forced marriage to somebody that was about 4 times her age, she chose to take her own life. And I feel nothing but compassion for this girl. She was facing an inescapable circumstance. It's very likely this inescapable circumstance caused mental health issues in her. So I agree with the academic community that mental health issues can be the cause of suicide. 54 to 55% of people that complete suicide have mental health conditions. But the mental health condition is the symptom of a greater issue of oppression. When you are oppressed like that, your pain is so great that you become crushed, like the Hebrew word, ratzatz. You become crushed. And it has nothing to do with demon possession. Elisha, Job, and Jonah all felt crushed in their circumstances, and they wanted to die. Elijah is mentioned in 1 Kings 19:4, Job in the 3rd chapter, and Jonah chapter 4, verse 3. They all asked their Creator to die. They expressed their desire to die. In Psalm 16:10 and 34, it talks about the despair of righteous people who were pushed to the point of feeling like they wanted to die. It said that they were in the beginning stages of Sheol. The beginning stages of Sheol are despair and depression. And when a person dies by suicide, if they're righteous, there's no indication that they're condemned. Isaiah 14:9, Jonah 2:3, Psalm 34, Psalm 49:16, and the book of Enoch 50, verse 1 through 2, all mentions that the righteous also dwell in Sheol, where they have been pushed beyond despair and depression. And I want to encourage people to search this out also for themselves in the Hebrew Bible to understand the compassion for people who are oppressed and crushed to the point of suicide. It's important to understand, because when we don't show compassion and empathy to those who are suffering with suicidal ideation, they are less likely to seek help. And there's a chance that we could save human lives by extending compassion and understanding for them, for their circumstances, and heeding the call of Jeremiah 22:3 and Isaiah 58:6 to help them out of those circumstances. It's our duty. There's not one situation in the Hebrew Bible in which the survivors of suicide are told that they have blood guilt on their hands. Not one. And so that compassion also extends to the survivors of suicide. They should not be given moral judgments telling them that it was their fault, or that they are the ones who drove their loved ones to suicide. It is the oppressors of this world, the rulers of this earth, that oppress and crush people, who are to blame for the crumbling situations that lead to suicide, that drive people to suicide. Who are the people creating inescapable circumstances for people who die by suicide? They are the oppressors of the world. And also, I want to encourage those who have struggled or are currently struggling with suicidal ideation to choose life. It is a cruel world, and I completely acknowledge that there are many people struggling in this world. It was prophesied that the descendants of Sarah and Abraham would be as many as the sand of the seas. There are millions and millions of people, not in Israel, who are the descendants of Sarah and Abraham, who need help and compassion out of their oppression. I want to also share with you the link to my story as a survivor of suicide, and I'm going to drop it in the description section of this comment. I encourage you, please, if you're struggling with suicidal ideation, to read the story and understand the devastation of suicide and how it impacts survivors. And my message of that story is to understand the devastation and please choose life. Shalom to you.